YIFAT Susskind, what is the Salvador option, and how does this weigh in here?
The Salvador option is the name of a policy that the Pentagon began instituting in early 2005. It was a decision to arm and train the Shiite-based militias in Iraq in order to use them as forces against the anti-U.S. insurgency. And under the so-called Salvador option, those groups received money and weapons and training, military training by the Pentagon, by the U.S. military under the command of a man named James Steele, who's a colonel in the U.S. Army. This happened during John Negroponte's stint as U.S. ambassador. And
that was to Honduras. 25 years ago, he was ambassador to Honduras. Now, talking about his being ambassador to Iraq.
Right. Back in 2005, he was the U.S. ambassador to Iraq. And Steele, who commanded the Salvador option, worked together with John Negroponte in Central America during the 1980s. And, you know, it's almost a kind of sort of horrible joke that they would name this policy the Salvador option, because it's a reference, of course, to the U.S. backing of death squads in El Salvador. John Negroponte is the person who pulled together the death squads in Honduras. James Steele had much to do with the death squads of El Salvador. And these two men, you know, are sort of back in action in Iraq, sort of recycling that same policy.
Can you talk about the various forms of violence? You're talking about rape, you're talking about honor killings.
There's violence. Much of the violence is happening in the public sphere. In a lot of places in Iraq, women are virtually confined to their homes because of the likelihood of being beaten or abducted or raped out in the street. The so-called misery gangs, which I think is a really apt term, misery gangs of these Islamist militias, are patrolling and beating and harassing, in a lot of places outright assassinating anybody who's not dressed or behaved to their liking. The social vision of these groups really requires, as Hassan was saying, the subjugation of women and the outright elimination of anybody who poses a challenge to their vision of the future for Iraq. In addition to these kinds of, public sphere assaults, we're seeing a very sharp rise in violence within families, so-called honor killings. And there's also been, this has been somewhat in the media, a clear pattern of gender-based violence, rape, and other forms of sexualized torture in Iraqi jails by both Iraqi forces and the U.S. forces that preceded them.